The evidence is incontrovertible. Aerial cameras in American military reconnaissance planes made remarkable photographs, such as this one of a medium-range ballistic missile base, which documents the Soviet offensive buildup in Cuba. The Defense Department says there are 8 to 10 missile bases in Cuba. This photograph shows a surface-to-air missile assembly depot. The aerial surveillance program was behind President Kennedy's momentous proclamation of the blockade against ships delivering offensive weapons to Cuba. The hours ticked away toward a showdown as 25 Soviet ships steamed toward the armada of U.S. Navy ships picketing Fidel Castro's island. In Washington, the Organization of American States lines up almost unanimously behind President Kennedy's call for the blockade. This extraordinary session demonstrates the greatest Western Hemisphere solidarity since World War II. The vacant seat of Cuba, grimly significant as Secretary of State Dean Rusk says the new Soviet intervention means a further enslavement of the Cuban people by Soviet power, and warns it challenges as never before inter-American commitments to defend the hemisphere. At the United Nations, on the eve of the 17th anniversary of the opening session, the World Organization meets its newest challenge. The acting Secretary General U Thant seeks to mediate the U.S.-Soviet crisis. While the U.S. agrees to talks, it stands firm for the removal of the offensive weapons. The Soviet representative, Valerian A. Zorin, announces he will veto a draft of a resolution introduced by the U.S. calling for the removal of the weapons. He makes a bitter attack on the American president's decision to impose the quarantine on ships bearing arms to Cuba. His denunciation of the U.S. is echoed by the Cuban representative. U.S. Ambassador Adlai E. Stevenson, in blunt language, states his government's position.
We now know that the Soviet youth, not content with Dr. Castro's oath of fealty, not content with the destruction of Cuban independence, not content with the extension of Soviet power into the Western Hemisphere, not content with a challenge to the inter-American system and to the United Nations Charter, has decided to transform Cuba into a base for communist aggression, into a base for putting all of the Americas under the nuclear gun, and thereby to intensify the Soviet diplomacy of blackmail in every part of the world. There is a road to peace. The beginning of that road is marked out in the resolution I have submitted for your consideration. If we act promptly, we will have another chance to take up again the dreadful questions of nuclear arms and military bases, and the means and causes of aggression and of war, to take them up and do something about them. This is a solemn, I believe, and significant day for the life of the United Nations and the hope of the world community. Let it be remembered not as the day when the world came to the edge of nuclear war, but as the day when men resolved to let nothing thereafter stop them in their quest for peace. Thank you, sir.
Meanwhile, there are reports from inside Red Cuba of tightened controls on consumer goods to halt a wave of panic buying, apparently inspired by the United States arms blockade. Also, scenes such as this are reported by a correspondent who notes that all salient points in Havana and open spaces on the long waterfront are provided with anti-aircraft guns and mortars, manned by troops, militia, or armed students. But behind it all is the story of divided control that sows chaos in Cuba. It is pointed out that although Premier Fidel Castro is still the nominal head of Cuba, the Russians are generally acknowledged as the real masters. The population has been frightened into obedience and is told little of the general confusion within the ranks of the Cuban government, nor perhaps of the real danger that lies ahead if the missile base buildup in their Red Island goes on. The hour has arrived for Fidel Castro in a Cuba where, as one observer puts it, nobody is really in control. At the U.S. Guantanamo Navy base in Cuba, several thousand American dependents are evacuated. Some received only as little as 10 minutes' notice of the exodus. Castro has demanded U.S. withdrawal from Guantanamo and only last week moved up 5,000 to 6,000 troops near the base. There are new arrivals as well at Gitmo, as it is known in Navy slang. As a military precaution, President Kennedy announces that the base has been reinforced and additional units ordered to stand by on an alert basis. The Pentagon moves swiftly to bolster the Navy and Marines, extending enlistments and tours of duty at a time when a nation that seeks peace for the world must enforce a mighty arms blockade.